Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Holman, and I'm the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. I'd like to thank you for taking time today to join us for our webinar, Using Variation and Comparisons to Inform Instructional Recommendations. Today, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Jeremy Grant. Dr. Grant is an assistant professor of school psychology and a nationally certified school psychologist. He has a doctorate in school psychology from Teachers College at Columbia University. Dr. Grant has spent the last several years training in both educational and clinical settings. He has a passion for social justice and desires to bridge racial, ethnic, and cultural gaps in education to ensure equitable outcomes for all students. We're excited to welcome you today to learn how you can use variation and comparison procedures to inform instructional recommendations. During the presentation, please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. A recording of today's presentation and certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants. The recordings from our previous webinars can also be found at our website at info.riversideinsights.com/clinicalpd. A link to today's handout can be found in the chat. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Grant.
Thank you, Dr. Holman, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our third and final webinar in a series regarding the variation and comparison procedures when using the WJ4. For those of you who are new to this series, welcome. For those of you who are returning from series 1 and 2, welcome back. Today, what we're going to be focused on is really thinking about extending what we have learned from sessions 1 and 2 regarding the variation and comparison procedures. And hopefully by the end of today's session, it pulls everything together from sessions 1, 2, and today's, so that way you have a deeper understanding of how to understand your examinee using these comparison and variation procedures. And that also would include an understanding of how you can use these procedures to inform treatment and/or educational planning. So what I was thinking of doing as I was making this presentation was trying to figure out how can we tie together all of what we spoke about and also connect that to recommendations and interventions. So to really demonstrate the utility of these procedures, I'm going to be leading us through a series of mini case studies, giving you a brief background of some hypothetical individuals, kind of talking about test selection rationale, embedding those variation and comparison procedures into the discussion, helping you to interpret some of that data. And then I'll be mentioning some resources that you can use to engage in instructional planning or to engage in narrowing down what recommendations you might use based on the data from the variation and comparison procedures. So when we think about our first mini case study, we have a student named Sarah. Sarah is an 11-year-old girl who identifies as white, and her primary language spoken in the home is English, and that's also her native language. And she's currently enrolled in the 5th grade in general education classes. For a bit more context, this first mini case study is focused on psychoeducational evaluations. The second one that I'll talk about will be more aligned with neuropsych, and then the third will be more aligned with speech language. So kind of giving you a brief introduction on how to use the WJ and these procedures for different types of evaluations as well. But in the case of Sarah here, Sarah was referred for a private psychoeducational evaluation by her mother due to concerns regarding her mathematics skills. And that was identified by her in-class performance and difficulties with homework that she's been having. She currently receives supplementary instruction from a special education teacher to improve her math calculation skills as part of a specialized tutoring program. She does not evidence any complications in any other core content area based on in-class assessments, results from district and statewide standardized tests, and school-wide screening measures. So despite this additional support from the special education teacher as a part of that tutoring program, she continues to struggle in mathematics when compared to her classmates. So based on this information, the private psychologist who is conducting that evaluation decides to utilize the WJ4 achievement, and they administered specific tests, tests 2, 5, and 10, which comprised the broad mathematics cluster. They followed a selective testing model, so they picked out tests that they believe would best fit the referral concerns in the child's presentation, and they determined, based on the WJ4 Achieves Examiner's Manual, that the broad mathematics cluster would be reasonable to use as a form of investigation because it provides a comprehensive measure of math achievement, It spans applied problem solving, number facility, automaticity, and quantitative knowledge. So given that Sarah is having some trouble within the domain of mathematics, the psychologist surmised that this broad mathematics cluster is a good measure of how she's doing overall. You'll also notice that the private psychologist also opted to administer tests 1, 3, 4, and 6 of the WJ4 achievement. Now, if you've given the WJ4 achieve before, you'll know that those tests fall outside of the mathematics domain, but they're needed to conduct intra-achievement variations using the WJ4 achievement. So what exactly are these procedures? So by administering those tests, the totality of tests 1 through 6, the psychologist is able to obtain a profile of Sarah's academic strengths and weaknesses through the intra-achievement variation procedures. Now, these procedures analyze variability within your examinee's academic profile. So to give you a bit more context about their utility, they can be helpful in identifying personal strengths and weaknesses. And they can also be helpful in identifying areas in which you want to capitalize on. So those would be the personal strengths of the individual, and areas that you might want to target for support or further intervention. Those would be areas that would be identified as personal weaknesses. Now I'm going to show you on the next slide some of the output for Sarah, and you'll notice that these variations in particular occur when you see that there's some sort of strength or some sort of difficulty in a specific area of achievement. That's in comparison to having generally low academic achievement across the board. So for example, when you look at the next slide, you're going to see how these variations can help indicate personal weaknesses in certain areas of mathematics when compared to maybe looking at someone who is stable in written expression and reading, but then still has some of those personal challenges in math, right? So that's kind of thinking about the strengths and weaknesses component, and how once you know those strengths and weaknesses, that lends itself to instructional planning. And the last bullet listed on this slide is talking about diagnostic and clinical impressions. So when we're thinking about those areas that might be of interest to investigate for SLD, whether it be for dyslexia or dyscalculia or for dysgraphia, we know there are particular areas of achievement that tend to be impacted, and particular areas of achievement, depending on the type of SLD, that tend to be relatively stable or strong. So again, this sort of procedure can help you see some of that fluctuation across an examinee score profile. So I know this slide is a little messy, but you're going to see some things pop up within the data table that you see at the top of the slide to help us kind of go through interpreting what these scores mean. I did go through some of this interpretation in the first session and in the second session, but I want to walk us all through how to interpret these tables just to make sure those who weren't in attendance the first and second session still have that context as we move forward. Because as we move forward, I won't go as in depth in describing each individual column, but I'd like to do that just for this first presentation. So when we take a look here, we can see that this table of intra-achievement variations looks completely different than the normal table of scores that we would see towards the beginning of a score report when we use Riverside Score. And I'm going to walk you through how to interpret some of these scores. So if we look under standard scores, that column, you'll see that we have 3 types of standard scores that are available. We have the actual standard score for Sarah. And if we look at applied problems, we see her actual standard score for that test was 54. So that's the actual standard score, or the obtained standard score for Sarah on that test. We then see that the predicted score is 81. Now, for those of you who are not attending in attendance for session 1 and session 2, each of the WJ4 batteries has a set of core tests. For the WJ4 achievement, those core tests would be tests 1 through 6. And what ends up happening is those tests are used to form a prediction of how well a student would do on test of the WJ4 achievement. So this predicted score here is simply an average of a specific set of core tests on the achievement. We see that based on that average, she was predicted to obtain a standard score of 81 on applied problems. All right, so she actually got a score of 54, but she was predicted based on her abilities on other areas of achievement to get a score of 81. So she's performing a bit below expectations here. And we can verify that by looking at the difference score. That difference score is the difference between Sarah's actual standard score and her predicted standard score. So if we say 54 minus 81, we would obtain that negative 27 that you see listed there as the difference standard score. Another way to think of this is that Sarah's performance on applied problems was 27 standard score points below the score that she was predicted to demonstrate. Now you might be saying, how exactly do I make sense of this? Well, once we have that difference score, we use the discrepancy columns in order to really understand the magnitude of that difference. And you'll see that there's a discrepancy percentile rank and a discrepancy standard deviation. These two scores are vastly different than the traditional percentile rank and traditional standard deviation that you would see further up in your score report. So I'll give a definition of what these are. The discrepancy percentile rank, you can think of that as a base rate. If you remember back in your training, base rates provide an estimate, really just telling you how common or rare a score difference is within a given population. So in this case, we can see that that difference of negative 27 that Sarah has for applied problems is pretty rare because it only occurs in about 1% of the normative sample. Now, according to Sattler, differences between scores that occur in less than 10 to 15% of the norm reference population or norm reference group can be considered rare. So because this is less than 10 to 15% in terms of its occurrence, it's quite rare, or you can say that it's clinically significant. You'll see to the right that we have the discrepancy standard deviation, that's negative 2.40. And you can think of that as a critical value. So again, if you think back to your training, those critical values serve as a reference point, indicating whether or not that difference score occurred by chance or if it didn't occur by chance. Difference scores that meet or reach, or let me rephrase that, meet or exceed the clinical value are unlikely to have occurred by chance. So if we take a look here, we see that that negative 2.40 exceeds that value that's listed in the interpretation column of negative 1.50. Because it exceeds that threshold, we can say that this difference that Sarah demonstrated between her actual and predicted performance on applied problems is not only clinically significant, but also statistically significant. So it's likely that that difference did not occur by chance. So overall, what this is doing for us is it's letting us know that her performance on applied problems is a personal weakness for her in comparison to her performance in other areas of academic achievement. Now, if we take a look at the other two math tests that are listed here, calculation and math facts fluency, we can see that calculation, which as a reminder is an untimed measure of mathematical operations, was actually 0.80 standard deviations. Sorry, let me go ahead and do my animations here. 0.80 standard deviations above expectations. You'll see that her actual score was 100 and her predicted score was 89. Now, that's not meeting the threshold of plus 1.50 or above to be listed as a strength, but at the very least, it's also not listed as a weakness, right? So in this case, the psychologist figures out and says, hey, her performance on this test likely is due to that supplementary instruction she's receiving that specifically targets her calculation skills through that specialized tutoring program. Lastly, if we take a look at math facts fluency, we can see that that is also an area that's listed as a personal weakness for her. And we can see if we take a look that the difference between her actual performance and her predicted performance only occurs approximately 4 out of 100 times among her same age peers, or 4% of the time within the norm reference group or norm reference population. So that's giving us some indication of clinical significance. We also can look at that discrepancy standard deviation, see that that's negative 1.60, and that's giving us an idea of statistical significance because it's exceeding that threshold of negative 1.50. So in this case, we kind of see, to sum it up, a personal weakness in applied problems and a personal weakness in math facts fluency. Now, after identifying these significant intra-achievement variations, both in math problem solving and math facts fluency, the psychologist consults the WJ4 Achieves Examiner's Manual. I'm not sure if you all know that these tables or models are in the Examiner's Manual, but the Achieve Examiner's Manual has interpretive models, just giving you some ideas of the various skills that are measured by the WJ4 Achieve test. And I love these models because it also explains to you the level of complexity that is assigned to each of the tests that your examinee might have taken. You can find this specific table on page 91 of the examiner's manual, and in chapter 5 of the examiner's manual, there are tables like this for reading and for writing as well. So based on this table, the examiner can further understand that applied problems is conceptually the most complex measure of mathematical achievement on the WJ4, and that it demanded Sarah to analyze and solve practical problems. You can see that under the task demands to the right. Furthermore, by reviewing that 5th chapter that I mentioned, it does provide some interpretive information to kind of give the examiner a sense of what might have been the cause of the student struggling on this test. And the manual talks about how poor performance in applied problems could be related to limited math skills, reading comprehension difficulties, or poor mathematical reasoning abilities. Now, having access to that from the manual helps the psychologist really understand the possible domains that they need to rule out as being a cause for her low score and personal weakness on applied problems. Now, going back to some of the behavioral observations that were listed on the previous slide, and going back to some of her history, we know that she doesn't evidence any other complications in any other areas, right? Just in mathematics. So reading comprehension challenges are not evident based on her school history. So we know reading comprehension likely isn't a concern here. So that then leaves the psychologist to think about what can be an underlying cause of limited math skills or limited mathematical reasoning. They then start to think about the WJ4 cog. They think about how fluid reasoning is predictive of math reasoning skills. And they think that it's very important to rule out that lack of reasoning skills, given the challenges that Sarah had on applied problems. Now then, thinking about math facts fluency, which was also an area that was problematic for Sarah in this case study, based on that intra-achievement variation, what ended up happening here is that the psychologist is thinking about, even though it's a less complex task, the examiner is using that interpretive data from the 5th chapter to think about what could be the cause of a low score on math facts fluency. Well, we can think about a lack of automaticity or limited knowledge in basic math facts. Again, by reviewing this within the examiner's manual, that provides the psychologist with domains of further inquiry. They can think about how the WJ4 cog has processing speed test, which would be quite related to why the student might be struggling on a measure demanding automaticity, demanding speed, demanding accuracy, and so forth. So by administering the WJ4 cog's processing speed test, they're able to gain additional information to rule out or rule in causes related to her performance on math facts fluency. And I kind of gave some of this away already, but this is going into now the WJ4 cog test selection plan for Sarah. So as noted, based on the WJ4 Achieve findings, the psychologist recommends further assessment in the domains of fluid reasoning and cognitive processing speed. The psychologist understands that both of those domains are predictive of performance in applied problem solving and fluency, respectively. And by administering those domains of the WJ4 cog, the psychologist can determine if Sarah has any weaknesses in those cognitive areas that are related to the academic areas of interest. So what the psychologist is doing in this case is trying to look at variations in performance related to cognitive correlates. So aligning with this plan, the psychologist administers WJ4 cog test of fluid reasoning, which we can see here, number series, concept formation, and analysis synthesis. In addition to measures of cognitive processing speed, that would include letter pattern matching and pair cancellation. Notably, the WJ4 cog also has several narrow ability clusters that allow you to really hone in very finely on specific ability areas you want to assess. So by administering test 2, number series, and test 15, analysis synthesis, that allows the examiner to derive the quantitative reasoning narrow ability cluster. And that concerns the ability to reason inductively and deductively with numerical information. So if Sarah's having trouble in quantitative reasoning, that could be quite related to the issues that she's having on applied math problem solving tasks. Lastly, you'll see that there are some other tests that are listed, tests 1, 3, 5, and 7. And those tests are administered in order for the examiner to be able to use the intracognitive variation procedures. Just like the WJ4 achieves variation procedures, the COGS variation procedures allow this psychologist to identify the presence of specific personal strengths and weaknesses in this student's score profile. And they can be conducted as long as the minimum test required are inputted into Riverside score. And that would be, as the slide shows, tests 1 through 7. These procedures are particularly helpful in Sarah's case because it can help the psychologist easily identify if she has any personal weaknesses in those cognitive domains related to mathematical achievement, like we mentioned before, such as fluid reasoning and quantitative reasoning, or cognitive areas related to academic fluency, like cognitive processing speed. So now here are the data for the intracognitive variation procedures across the clusters and tests of interest in the areas of cognitive processing speed, quantitative reasoning, and fluid reasoning. And you'll notice here, I'll actually highlight really quickly 2 of the clusters that are listed as personal weaknesses for Sarah. You'll see here that there are clusters available that will populate within these procedures as long as you've included the necessary tests for those clusters to populate. So in this case, I'm not only being told that fluid reasoning and quantitative reasoning are personal weaknesses for Sarah, I'm also getting test-specific information as well, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. But if you're looking for any more context about variation and comparison procedures, I will just make a point now before I forget to say, please review session 1 and session 2 in addition to the 5th chapter of the examiner's manual. Okay. Now, so looking at this table here, the psychologist does identify that Sarah has personal weaknesses in fluid reasoning and quantitative reasoning. And if you're familiar with these 2 domains of functioning, they're quite key in the achievement of a student related to higher order or applied academic tasks. And that would include mathematical problem solving. So we already know that those are areas that are personal academic weaknesses for Sarah. And now we have this cognitive data that's showing the underlying skills that she would need in order to really function well on those applied tasks. She also is struggling with those underlying skills as well. So this is nice that we have that domain related information, but what if we want to break things down a little bit more? Well, we can take a look at number series and concept formation, and those 2 tests are measures of inductive reasoning and logic. And it's important to take a look at the test specifically because even if the test falls within the same CHC broad ability area, they can be designed in a way where they have different task demands and they tap different narrow abilities, right? So in this case, when we look at number series and concept formation and the relationship with inductive reasoning and logic, those weaknesses in induction could impact Sarah in the classroom. Thinking about applied mathematical tasks, students often need to be able to make logical inferences or conclusions, and sometimes that's as a byproduct of engaging in pattern recognition. So if she's struggling with that inductive reasoning and logic, it's going to be hard for her to make some of those logical inferences and conclusions. We also see that analysis synthesis, I said that correctly 3 times. I knew I was going to have trouble with it the 4th, so that's a little bit of my humor coming out. But Sarah was also found to have a personal weakness in deductive reasoning based on her performance on this test. Now, weaknesses in deductive reasoning may impact Sarah's ability to reason and draw conclusions based on given rules. And lastly, if we take a look at cognitive processing speed, even though the overall domain was not a personal weakness for her, I think it's still important for us to investigate that test-specific variation that we see here in pair cancellation. So when we take a look at that test, if you remember, it's a measure of executive processing, attention and concentration, and processing speed. And according to the examiner's manual, it does provide us with some good information about an examinee's ability to sustain attention and to remain vigilant. Because if you remember that test, they're thinking about searching for a specific pattern of visual stimuli over a prolonged period of time. So that information is very important because it provides the psychologist with some additional evidence to support the possibility that that math facts fluency score may have been notably impacted by some of these observed challenges in sustaining attention and in processing speed and in vigilance and so forth. So overall, really the point of engaging in these intracognitive variations is it helps the psychologist further understand how Sarah's underlying cognitive abilities may be impacting her ability to demonstrate her academic skills on measures of achievement. Now, so far I've been talking about intra-achievement, intracog, and that's staying within a battery of tests. So intracog is all cog, intra-achievement is all achievement. I want to now talk a little bit about a different type of procedure, which is a comparison. So we talked about variations. Now we're going to talk about comparison procedures. And what these comparison procedures do, in this case of scholastic aptitude to achievement, is it's using specific WJ4 cog clusters to predict how Sarah should do on specific areas of achievement. Now, these type of comparisons here, the scholastic aptitude comparisons, each of these scholastic aptitude clusters are comprised of 4 tests. And the 4 tests that are used from the WJ4 cog to predict achievement, those 4 tests were selected because they offer the best prediction of how a student is expected to do in the achievement area of interest. So let me give you an example of this. When we take a look at math problem solving, we see that the WJ4 cog tests that are most predictive of math problem solving on the WJ4 Achieve would be oral vocabulary, numbers reversed, visualization, and analysis synthesis. So when you think about those 4 tests were specifically selected to create the aptitude cluster that is used to predict how well Sarah should do on the math problem solving cluster on the WJ4 achievement. Now, these specific comparisons are important because they look at consistency in performance, right? So when you look at some of the other comparison procedures in the examiner's manuals, those are more so looking at traditional discrepancies, whereas this one is looking at consistency. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If Sarah has low math problem solving aptitude based on her performance on these 4 tests that are listed here, then we would also expect her to have low mathematical achievement on the actual math problem solving cluster of the WJ4 Achieve. So that would be consistent if she's low in both. But if she's high or more developed on the cog and less developed on the Achieve, that would give us some indication of inconsistency in what she is actually demonstrating based on her aptitude from the cognitive. I'm going to take you all through an example to make this more concrete. So here's just one scholastic aptitude to achievement comparison that I want to walk you all through. There were some other data, but for ease of interpretation, I've only included this one piece. And I'm going to walk everyone through column by column because there is a new column that is unique to the scholastic aptitude comparisons. So just like before, when we look at the actual column here, that's actually the score that the student, that Sarah, obtained on the math problem solving cluster on the WJ4 achievement. That's still the same. What is new is this SAPT column that we see here. What that column represents is the uncorrected average, and I'll repeat that again, the uncorrected average of the 4 WJ4 cog tests that were used to predict Sarah's performance on the math problem solving cluster of the achievement. So that 104, just to be even more clear, is the uncorrected average of how she did on the 4 cognitive tests you see listed on the bottom of the screen here. So the uncorrected average of oral vocabulary, visualization, numbers reversed, and analysis synthesis. Now, the problem with that is that it's the uncorrected average. So we don't want to use that in terms of our interpretation and in basing our understanding of how the student did. So what we would do is we would use that predicted score here. That predicted score is statistically corrected through regression to the mean. So then that way we can use that predicted score as our basis of how well Sarah should have done on math problem solving. The difference score is still the same as it was before when we discussed that variation procedure. It's still the actual score, which is 84, minus the predicted score, which is 103. That gives us a difference score of -19. And then the discrepancy percentile rank and discrepancy standard deviation are also still the same in terms of their interpretation. That percentile rank is still giving us an idea of the base rate, and the discrepancy standard deviation is still giving us an idea of the critical value. So in this case, we can see that the difference that Sarah is evidencing between her math problem solving aptitude and her actual math problem solving on the achievement really only occurs about 4% of the time within the norm reference group. So we can say that this difference between her aptitude and actual achievement is inconsistent and that it's clinically significant. And we can also see that there's statistical significance because that discrepancy SD of -1.73 exceeds the threshold that we set in Riverside score of -1.50. So this gives us a lot of great information to say that based on her cognitive aptitude, Sarah should have been able to demonstrate higher levels of achievement than she did in the area of math problem solving. So now thinking about just a summary, because we did talk about a lot of data, and then I'm going to get into some recommendations. We see in the WJ4 cog, again, personal weaknesses in fluid reasoning, quantitative reasoning, number series, concept formation, analysis synthesis, and pair cancellation. We discussed those as part of the intracognitive variations. In terms of the intra-achievement variations, we discussed personal weaknesses in applied problems and math facts fluency. And then in terms of the comparison procedure we just discussed, we discussed how there is clinical and statistical significance regarding the difference between her math problem solving aptitude as measured by the WJ4 cog and her actual achievement in the area of math problem solving as measured by the WJ4 achievement. So we got a lot of information about this student using those variation procedures. And do keep in mind that there was more information than that that you normally would get as a part of a score report. I only included the variations on those tables that were related to the areas of interest. And I also left out some points on the aptitude achievement comparison just to have ease of interpretation. But there's a lot more rich information than what I showed that you would get as a part of these procedures. So then what do we do now that we have all of this information? We can start to think about recommendations for Sarah. And with all the data that we have, that psychologist is now ready to consider the ways that Sarah's educators might be able to help her. And one really great tool that can be utilized in practice is this underlined point that I have here called the WIP. And the WIP stands for the WJ4 Interpretation and Instructional Interventions Program. And that is an add-on that can be used with Riverside Score that provides more comprehensive reporting. It provides interpretive information regarding your students' data, and it also includes recommendations that are evidence-based. And those recommendations are provided to you based on how your student performed on the test in clusters administered to them. So these recommendations that you see here were pulled from the WIP. I did not have to refer to a specific book. I did not have to refer to a certain resource. I can trust that the WIP has these evidence-based recommendations for me to select from based on my understanding of the student's academic profile, based on their current school placement, and any other information that I was provided. I'm going to read through these first two recommendations just to give you some context about how useful they could be. So this first one here, or both of them here, are related to math problem solving. So based on how she did on applied problems, the WIP provided me with these recommendations. So for one, have Sarah keep a math journal and ask her to record the steps she follows to solve a problem. These written explanations can help identify areas of misunderstanding or gaps in understanding. Additionally, before introducing a new lesson, ask Sarah to write an explanation of 1 or 2 key skills needed for the lesson. So if we're thinking about a student who is having trouble with kind of conceptualizing these problems when they're working on them, that recommendation actually might be of interest to you because it gives you the chance to see what exactly is going through Sarah's head as she's starting to work on some of these problems. And if I can get a sense of what's actually part of her thought process, I can help to identify some of those challenges she's having in comprehending and making sense of this content. So that way we can be more proactive and help her start to self-regulate and self-monitor. And then even this piece about introducing a new lesson, having her write an explanation of 1 or 2 key skills that are needed, that also helps you to see if she's aware of her own kind of requirements and needs and what she's expected of as a part of that lesson. So that recommendation might be one the psychologist could, might be interested in using. And again, I didn't have to refer to any specific text or resource aside from inputting the data into Riverside Score, selecting a comprehensive reporting option, and choosing interventions as my, choosing the intervention that I wanted for the student. I do have other recommendations as well for math problem solving in the slides as well, but for the sake of time, because I would love to get through another case study, I'm going to jump to our second case study here, which is Jacob, just to give you an idea of how these variation and comparison procedures don't have to just be used within school settings, because I imagine some of our listeners might be engaged in private practice work. We might have some individuals working as neuropsychologists, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can use it aside from psychoeducational assessment. So this next case is thinking about a student named Jacob. He's a 21-year-old college senior enrolled in a private college. He identifies as Black in terms of race and Hispanic in terms of his ethnicity. English is his native language, and English is also primarily spoken in the home. He's currently placed in college in a variety of general education courses, and he does not take any developmental level courses. Now, why is he being seen by a neuropsych? Well, Jacob suffered a traumatic brain injury as a part of a car accident. So he self-referred in response to that. And in response to that car accident that happened earlier this spring, he's now starting to notice that he's having some concerns with following multi-step directions, being able to recall information from conversations, and so forth. All of these things that could be impacted in response to a traumatic brain injury. He currently is seeing a generalist and a neurologist for ongoing medical treatment, and he's hoping that this evaluation can help identify his current levels of memory-related functioning, because he wants to have some sort of justification and evidence aside from just the ongoing medical notes to support his case for accessibility services. So based on the referral concerns, Jacob is administered a series of tests that fit in with short-term working memory, long-term retrieval, and processing speed. And we can see here that the neuropsychologist opts to administer verbal attention, numbers reversed, and object number sequencing, which are measures of short-term working memory. And they pick those tests because they realize that short-term working memory is a skill that's crucial to being able to hold information in mind and do something with it, like being able to hold multi-step directions in mind long enough to be able to process each step and execute each step. So that's why they're focusing on short-term working memory. In terms of the individuals, in terms of Jacob's challenges in remembering content from conversation, that cues the neuropsychologist into long-term retrieval. So again, that domain is looking at being able to efficiently store, consolidate, and retrieve information that was previously learned. So if we're thinking about breaking long-term retrieval down a bit, that includes meaningful memory and associative memory. And what Jacob is talking about, that challenge in remembering information from conversations, sounds an awful lot like meaningful memory, right? Being able to remember information that has in some ways some semantically rich context around it or meaning behind it. So the neuropsychologist focuses on story recall for that purpose. And then they also are curious to see how his associative memory is as well. So they administer visual auditory learning. Lastly, the reason why cognitive processing speed is included is because processing speed acts to make short-term memory more efficient. Because again, if you remember, our short-term memory is limited in its capacity and in the duration in which we could hold information in mind. So if your processing speed is really, really quick, you tend to then also have more efficient short-term working memory. In the case of for Jacob, those who sustain brain injuries may experience slow processing speed, and that can impact their learning, their comprehension, their ability to respond to posed questions. So that's why the neuropsych is focusing on processing speed as well. Now you'll see, aside from those measures, they also decide to administer tests 1, 2, 5, and 7. Now again, what that's doing is they're filling in the gaps needed to have tests 1 through 7 of the WJ4 cognitive, so then that way they can have those core tests available, because those core tests are needed at minimum to run an intracognitive variation procedure. And the neuropsychologist was interested in engaging in these procedures because they wanted to see, based on Jacob's reports, they wanted to see if there were any significant fluctuations in their short-term working memory, cognitive processing speed, and or their long-term retrieval. So starting off, the neuropsychologist begins to review this table of data, and they focus on these 3 clusters here. And as you can see, the overall performances across these 3 domains, short-term working memory, cognitive processing speed, and long-term retrieval, those are all listed as personal weaknesses for Jacob when compared to other aspects of his cognitive functioning. Now, just as a reminder, predicted levels of performance are based on specific core tests of the WJ4 cog. So short-term working memory has a specific set of tests that are used to predict how someone should do in that area. Cognitive processing speed has a different set of core tests, and then long-term retrieval has a different set of core tests. There's a table in the 5th chapter of the examiner's manual that outlines which core tests are used to predict how someone should do on particular areas of functioning. Now, although knowing that these 3 clusters are personal weaknesses for Jacob, that's great, that's good information. But as I mentioned before, each of these tests that fall under these respective clusters vary in task demands, and they also vary in terms of the narrow abilities that they tap. So it's probably a good idea for the neuropsychologist to take a look at the test level variations. So if you take a look at verbal attention, we're looking at Jacob's ability to hold and manipulate information in his immediate awareness, because it's a short-term working memory task. It also has some components of seeing how well he can hone his attention. And when we take a look at his performance in this area, we see that he performed about 1.95 standard deviations below expectations. And that meets statistical significance based on that threshold set in Riverside score. We also see that that difference is not only statistically significant, but clinically significant because of that discrepancy percentile rank of 3. So that level of difference is only observed in about 3% of individuals in the norm reference group. So now what this is telling the neuropsychologist is that this measure that partly looks at attentional control, partly looks at short-term working memory, that's a real personal weakness for Jacob, and that it's clinically and statistically significant. They then turn to story recall, and now this is looking at meaningful memory, or memory for information where the units of data that you have to remember are meaningfully related. And we see here that this is also a personal weakness for Jacob as well, right? So now the neuropsychologist is able to connect the challenges that he's having in remembering information and conversations to his performance on story recall, because we tend to need meaningful memory to learn and recall reports from other people during our day-to-day lives. Numbers reversed, as we see. Numbers reversed is a measure of working memory capacity or attentional capacity. And we can see that his performance on this test also was a personal weakness, right? So thinking again about how limited working memory capacity limited attentional capacity, just like when we think about verbal attention being a personal weakness, how that can impact how much information Jacob could hold in his awareness and work on at any given time. And if that's really impacted, that could be related to his difficulties in managing multi-step directions. And just going through the last two tests here that are listed as weaknesses, we have object number sequencing. And we obviously know again that this is a short-term working memory task and a memory measure of memory capacity. So again, this is looking at adding more evidence for the challenges that underlie Jacob's ability to hold information in his immediate awareness for goal-directed purposes. And then lastly, we have pair cancellation. Thinking about that particular test, even though we also had mentioned that cognitive processing speed was a weakness, we might want to hone in on those specific tests to look at specific abilities that are personally weak for him. And in this case, we can see that for pair cancellation, as I mentioned before, it's really looking at how well the examinee could inhibit automatic responses, manage cognitive interference, and remain vigilant in the face of distractors. So we can see that a task related to those elements is a personal weakness for him, and that's also great information for us to have. So now that the neuropsychologist looked at within variations for the cognitive, they then wanted to think about, okay, how does his performance in some of these more processing related areas, how does that relate to his overall reasoning skills? Well, the WJ4 does offer a specific comparison, the GFGC to other ability comparison, that would be very useful for a person like Jacob. And I say the GFGC over something like the GIA comparison because the GIA comparison would include in part measures of short-term working memory and measures looking at processing speed. So because we know that those are already personal weaknesses for him, it might be a better representation of his reasoning skills to look at a composite like the GFGC that excludes some of those processing related components because it only looks at verbal and nonverbal reasoning skills. So by using this form of comparison, the GFGC to other ability, what this allows the neuropsychologist to do is compare Jacob's overall verbal and nonverbal reasoning skills to other areas of cognitive ability. You might be asking, what are some of those other areas that you can compare his reasoning scores or skills to? Well, if you take a look here, the neuropsychologist is able to compare his overall reasoning skills to his cluster performances in short-term working memory, cognitive processing speed, and long-term retrieval. And what the results of this procedure really tells the neuropsychologist is that based on his reasoning skills, which you'll see under the predicted column here, based on his reasoning skills, Jacob was really expected to do a lot better on short-term working memory, cognitive processing speed, and long-term retrieval tasks because his actual performance is much less than his predicted performance, and that predicted performance is based on how he did on the GFGC composite. You will notice some slight fluctuations just due to regression to the mean, so I will call that out. But it's really important to have this information because now when Jacob's in the classroom and he's trying to engage in some reasoning tasks, this table gives us some evidence to say that his overall reasoning skills and his ability to demonstrate those are likely being impacted by these personally weak and less developed processing and memory related capabilities. That's really great information for the neuropsychologist to have. So then just running through a summary before I go through just some resources with you all as a part of the presentation that I made. I'll discuss some of the resources that I used. But going through a summary of Jacob's data, we can see again that for working memory, which is GWM, we see personal weaknesses in the overall cluster, verbal attention, numbers reversed, and object number sequencing. We also see personal weaknesses in long-term retrieval, and specifically on a test of story recall. We see personal weaknesses in processing speed, looking at the overall cluster, verbal attention, numbers reversed, and pair cancellation. And then also in that comparison that I mentioned, looking at his overall reasoning skills to his performances across working memory, processing speed, and long-term retrieval. So with all of that, again, rich information that this individual has now gotten on Jacob, the neuropsychologist can then turn to that same program that I mentioned before, the WIP, to be able to pull specific recommendations for certain areas of functioning. Now, when you utilize the WIP, you're able to also specifically see which recommendations relate to which area of functioning or which specific test. So it can be very helpful in identifying recommendations that may be applicable based on areas that you've identified are personal weaknesses for your student. So I'll go through a couple of these examples. So for short-term working memory, we can see here, for example, that accommodations may be useful in compensating for Jacob's limitations in working memory. Some examples include keeping oral directions short and simple, asking Jacob to paraphrase directions to ensure that he understands them, and providing visual cues for directions or steps to be followed. Now, I know that for most of us, we probably know that these are memory-related accommodations or strategies that we could use on an IEP or a 504, but for those who are brand new to the field, maybe are not sure of what they might be able to put, maybe if they're not sure that that's even evidence-based, at least this provides a very nice starting point. Or if you were thinking about a recommendation along these lines, that can be very affirming to see that this program also provides something similar based on its analysis of Jacob's performance. In terms of long-term retrieval, I'll go through maybe one recommendation here. So even looking at number 2, so thinking about how active learning or attending to and thinking about the material is important for Jacob to acquire new knowledge or to benefit from any memory strategies. So he may have better recall when he is actively involved in the learning process. So that recommendation may be one that the neuropsychologist hadn't thought of, but it really talks about the importance of figuring out how can I make this student be consistently motivated, feel included, and really be invested in the learning process. So that really puts that point in mind for the educators if that's something that isn't being thought of. And then in terms of cognitive processing speed, just thinking of an example here. So I'll read number 4 as an example that the WIP provided. So speed drills focus performance on completing a task quickly. When Jacob's performance on familiar tasks is timed and his progress is monitored, his speed may increase. Allowing Jacob to chart his progress can provide additional motivation. Speed drills can be teacher or student directed, or they may make use of technologies such as computerized programs, select programs or games that provide Jacob with immediate feedback and maintain a record of his performance over time. So that again is a pretty good recommendation that you might suggest for a student struggling with cognitive processing speed. And if that is something you weren't thinking of before, this at least gives you an idea to go off of. Now, I know that I only have a few minutes left. I know that all of our attendees are always super busy, particularly around this time of year. So I will call out that I do have a third case study that is a part of this presentation. What I'm going to do is make sure that my contacts at Riverside receive my presentation with my notes. So it does have some good context related to the slides that can help you go through them if you have time. But what I do want to call out are some of the resources that were used or referenced as a part of this presentation. So to the left, you will see the WJ4 reports, recommendations, and strategies text by Mather and Jaffe. It was published in 2016. I use it as a reference for myself in a norm reference testing course that I teach. It has a lot of great information from sample reports to ways in which to describe certain scores to a lot of tables that also break down what a lot of these procedures mean that I discussed today. So if you don't have that in your toolbox, I definitely recommend purchasing it. To the middle, there's the WIP. I'm going to talk a little bit more about an event that's going to be happening tomorrow, a webinar related to the WIP. But as I mentioned, it is an add-on to Riverside Score, and that can be purchased and added on to your current existing Riverside Score account. It provides you with interpretive reports that can include recommendations like some of the ones that are included in this presentation. And it also has handy forms and checklists that can be integrated into the interpretive reports that it generates. And lastly, to the right, you'll see that there is a WJ4 Dyslexia Assessment Service Bulletin. So for the third case study that I did not have time to get to today, I did reference that service bulletin, and I reference it often when I think about dyslexia assessment when using the WJ4. For each of these images here, I hyperlinked more information to them. So if you just click on the picture when you receive these slides, you should be able to be brought to the respective websites for these resources so you can utilize them. Now I'll just do a quick call out for any of you that have your phone handy, or if not, you could feel free to scan this QR code later on. This is a QR code to the registration link for a WIP webinar that's being conducted tomorrow by Dr. Tammy Stevens. That WIP webinar is going to discuss the WIP program itself in a lot more detail than I did today. And it's going to be providing you with a case study to help you tie together your understanding of how the WIP takes that assessment data and can be used then for instructional programming. So I thought I would call this out since I did mention the WIP a couple of times. So for those of you who have questions about it or are unsure about it, please be sure to check out the webinar that will be happening tomorrow, May 3rd. And lastly, I do have my contact information here. So if you ever have any questions or need any resources, I'm always happy to help and provide whatever I have. So feel free to email me. And I want to thank you all for your attendance and engagement. I hope that going through the 2 case studies was helpful just to get some idea of how we can identify areas for intervention for students. And I also hope that calling out the WIP and also some of the other resources that will be useful for you in instructional planning and treatment planning.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Grant, for the amazing presentation and the valuable information that you've shared over the course of the 3 webinar series about how the variation and comparison procedures can really augment your analysis and your understanding of your examinee. We do have one question that just came in, if you have a second. What
Sure.
is the difference between the WIP and the WJ book that you recommend?
Sure. So just to go back, so the book here is not a, let's see if I could put this in a condensed way. So I'll start with the WIP. So the WIP is an add-on digital resource that when you purchase it through Riverside Insights, gets added to your institution's Riverside Score account. And the WIP specifically would allow for a different type of report to be available to you. So you would have interpretive reports that can provide some interpretive statements about the test and clusters that you administer to your students. It also provides you some information regarding recommendations and interventions, like I mentioned before. So you get access to a recommendations bank that you typically wouldn't have if you did not sign up for the WIP. And when you select those recommendations as a part of the WIP, it embeds those recommendations into the interpretive report. Some of the other pieces that I mentioned before is that it does come with some forms and some checklists that also get integrated into that integrative report as well. And there's also a dyslexia report too that's available. So if you are doing a dyslexia assessment, there is a dyslexia report that the WIP provides you that's based on the framework that is in the assessment service bulletin number 6. So that's kind of the WIP in a nutshell. And again, there is a webinar tomorrow that will be much more comprehensive than my brief 30-second spiel. To the left is I like to think of this as almost like a reference text or a reference book. It does have sample reports that it has in it. But when I say sample reports, I mean literally it's a sample report that someone else has written. So it kind of gives you an idea of maybe what does a neuropsych report using the WJ in some way look like, or what does a psychoed look like if it's using it, or speech language assessment look like. So it's not necessarily generating a specific report based on your specific examinee. It's just giving you a template to say this is what somebody else wrote about when they describe this particular cluster or this particular test. It does have a very great recommendations section that can be used to supplement what the WIP has, so I will call that out. It does have a lot of great recommendations in it. The difference though is that because it's a physical book, you would have to figure out how you were going to adapt those recommendations for your specific report. Whereas the WIP is going to put recommendations into a report for you. And then the strategies piece is also important. That's not just strategies for the student in school, it also gives you some strategies and ways to think about assessment and testing. So I like to think about the WIP as a tool that can be helpful for reporting and recommendations. And I like to think of the reference text to the left as being a real good resource if you're unsure about a particular type of score or unsure about particular types of clusters or tests. It really gives a lot of great information that supplements what's in the examiner's manual already. I could go on, but I know we're over time, so I hope that gives the attendees some general understanding of the differences. But if you're considering either or, I would almost say do both, because I think they both have very good strengths and utility for practitioners.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that again to just reiterate that the WIP is going to generate recommendations based on your specific evaluee's results, either on the WJ or the ECAD. So it is a little bit more individualized than what you would find in Mather and Jaffe's book for obvious reasons. We do have a few other questions about the WIP. It does create a report. It is not going to be a templated report because it is based on your individual examinee's results. And this is a question for you, Dr. Grant, if you have just a second. Can you use the WIP only with the test of achievements, or do you need to administer the COG and oral language to run the comprehensive report or the dyslexia report on the WIP?
That's a really great question. So you can use the WIP for an individual battery if you wanted to. So in that attendee's example, if I just administered, let's just say test 1 through 20 of the Achieve, like the whole thing, you can run a comprehensive interpretive report on just the achievement. For the dyslexia reports, that's a little bit different because the dyslexia reports do require specific tests in order to be run. I apologize for not remembering offhand what specific tests are needed to run it, but I know that there are specific tests that are required to run the dyslexia report. And if you don't include those tests, you won't be able to populate a dyslexia report. But I will say that using this service bulletin to the right, it does talk about primary and secondary characteristics of dyslexia. So if you are just using the achievement, say as a special educator doing the academic testing in a school, this bulletin will be helpful for you to identify what tests off of the achievement would be helpful for my team to have data on if I only have access to the WJ4 Achieve. So you still could use, if not the dyslexia assessment, because it has those specific requirements, you could choose to use the WIP, still use that comprehensive testing, get some of that interpretive information on the tests that we know are important to administer off of the achievement for dyslexia assessment. So I hope that helps. There is like a slight way around that if for some reason you're missing a test or two in terms of your possession, you still can do some of that comprehensive reporting with the tests you do have available.
Awesome. The assessment service bulletin can be found on our website on the clinical PD page where we have all of the ASBs listed. I want to thank you again, Dr. Grant, for the great presentation, and thank you to our attendees for coming today. And we hope to see you again soon, if not tomorrow at the WIP webinar, at another webinar that we're offering in the near future. Thank you very much, everybody.
Take care, everyone.